This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Support for this podcast and the following messages come from our friends at the Paul Mueller Company and Steiner. Please thank them. This podcast wouldn't be possible without their generous support.
Paul Mueller Company has been manufacturing quality brewing equipment since 1964. Our innovative design and engineering will save you time, labor, and ingredients, sending money back to your bottom line. Learn more about our new mobile hop module at paulmueller.com. This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Steiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
I think it's a big opportunity if you're a craft brewer to sort of differentiate yourself from the rest of the herd a little bit.
This week on the show, bottle conditioning. We've got a ton of great resources for you at the end of this episode, but first, here's a guy who's been bottle conditioning since before some of you were born.
So I'm Eric Warner, and I'm the founding brewmaster at Karbach Brewing Company in Houston, Texas.
Eric, how and why did you first get into bottle conditioning?
So really, it all goes back to my roots of my early brewery training, which I was lucky enough to have had in South Germany, specifically the Munich area of Bavaria, where they drank a lot of ice beer. And I actually interned before going to Weinstefan at a brewery that did bottle conditioned ice beer. As pretty much back in the late 80s, every brewery did. And I lived over in Germany for 4 years at that time, got some exposure to Belgian beers as well. And of course, there was a lot of bottle conditioning going on with those beers. So it was a really integral part of my early brewery training.
There's a lot of different ways to skin the bottle conditioning cat. Run us through some of the more popular methods and tell us about your preferred approach.
Yeah, so there's a couple, a few sort of parameter areas you have to consider. And, I think, first of all, you have to say, am I going to try to do I guess we'll call it the timing method. And, we're all, most of us are adults and have children and maybe have had children as a result of that method failing. So I sort of apply the same approach to package conditioning and trying to time it to leave this little bit of residual sugar in the beer, and I'm going to package it right away. And even if you say, like, especially with an ale, okay, well, I'm going to crash cool it now, and that'll sort of leave some sugar in there. I think that's really the yeast don't like that, and that can lead to more off flavors than good flavors. So I'm not a big proponent of the timing method. And so then you get to, okay, I'm either going to add sugar, a sugar source at the point of packaging, or I'm going to recondition in a tank and then sort of package that carbonated product. But a true bottle conditioning, of course, the re-fermentation is occurring in the bottle. Then we get to the sugar source itself, right? And are you using sugar or are you using wort? So in Germany, what they typically, traditionally have done is they actually use wort from a brew that they may be doing that day, and so they've got a conditioned tank of Weiss beer, and it's been cold conditioned, and they're like, okay, we're brewing another batch of wheat beer this day. Let's go ahead and pull off some wort from that, add it into that aged beer, put that in some kind of mixing tank or some other way of homogenizing that, and then they'll go ahead and package it. A little bit, cumbersome for a lot of kind of fairly apparent and obvious reasons. So the simplest way, obviously, is to add sugar, because that sugar is basically going to be 100% fermentable. You have a known mass that you can add to your known volume of beer, and the math becomes very easy to calculate how much CO2 would be generated from the re-fermentation. So sugar is, in most parts of the world outside of Bavaria, the most common method. And of course, that's what all of us who are homebrewers did and still do. So sugar is a good way to go, especially if you're just kind of getting into this and not really don't have a lot of experience with package conditioning. So that kind of addresses the whole source of sugar aspect. Then there's the whole type of yeast. Now, a lot of times folks that bottle condition a particularly higher ABV beers might actually use a different yeast than what they used for the primary fermentation. And of course, you want to add healthy, vigorous yeast, again, especially if it's a higher ABV product. I think there's obviously another fundamental consideration is, to what degree am I going to pre-clarify my beer? And the yeast, the re-fermentation in the bottle, of course, is going to generate a little bit of extra haze because you're going to have some additional yeast cells produced in the re-fermentation. So, what condition do you really want your beer to be in before you add the sugar source and the additional yeast? And I recommend adding additional yeast anyway, unless for some reason you are right at the tail end of a fermentation and you're going to package condition and get this mixture of sugar and your beer into the container right away. Because if the beer has been conditioning for a week or two, that yeast is not only gone dormant, but it may be really past its prime, not healthy, and you might have some problems with the re-fermentation. So I always recommend adding fresh yeast, no matter what yeast you're going to use.
You hear some folks talk about using lager yeast exclusively for bottle conditioning. What are your thoughts on that?
Love it for a few reasons. One, lager yeast tend to be, the obvious is they're going to function in any kind of range of temperature. So if you're not fortunate enough and you're just making a foray into package conditioning, but you don't have like a really highly sophisticated conditioning room or conditioning box, the lager yeast will re-ferment, at a wide range of temperatures. Lager yeast typically also tend to flocculate pretty well. So if you really want that yeast to kind of pack out in the bottle and not have a lot sort of floating in suspension, that's another good reason. And most commercially, available lager yeasts are going to be sort of a little more benign in their flavor contribution versus if you were to take something that wasn't a beer that wasn't brewed with a yeast that produces a lot of phenolic compounds, but then you add some kind of yeast that does do that, then you're really going to dramatically change the flavor and aroma profile of the beer. So the lager yeasts tend to be pretty clean. So those are some of the main reasons. And I've also found that the lager yeasts, all things being equal, tend to be a little more stable when it comes to autolysis. I find some ale strains, you're going to get off flavors related to yeast breakdown a little more quickly than you would with a lager yeast. So those are, I think, a few of the key advantages.
In addition to the methods you've mentioned so far, there's another approach to bottle conditioning that's described in a very popular TQ article written by Bill Pengelly in 1997. That article documented Deschutes' process for bottle conditioning with high Kreuzen wort. What are your thoughts on that process?
Yeah, great point. In fact, we're big lovers of Kreuzen here. Well, basically every brewery I've ever worked at, as a means to get a beer across the finish line, particularly a high ABV beer. I'm a huge believer, both in terms of getting the flavor and the RDF that you're looking for out of your beer, but also in terms of shelf stability and not having an over-carbonated product in the market, that you get your beer completely fermented. And so we'll Kreuzen. If we have some problem children in fermentation, we'll Kreuzen to get those kids into a full state of fermentation. But yeah, there are actually wheat beer producers in Germany that will use the Kreuzen method to add carbonation. And one of the huge advantages of that is that you have vigorously fermenting beer, and so that you're not going to have a stuck re-fermentation in the bottle. Again, the distinction there, of course, between ale and lager fermentations, if you're taking ale Kreuzen and you add it to a super cold beer, that may shock it down, or you are conditioning the bottles in an area that isn't low room temperature and above, then forget everything I just said. But yeah, I think Kreuzen's a good way to go. But again, you got to time it all up. And with an ale, that can become pretty tricky. So that's why a lot of times the German breweries will use lager Kreuzen, because lagers, they might be clicking along at, a degree or maybe max 2 degrees Plato per day. So you kind of have a good idea of how much fermentable sugar is left in that beer.
Coming up.
And I think if there's one, key thing to have burned into your brain when bottle conditioning, it's homogenization.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets May 10th. Need to build a food safety program for your brewery? Not sure what's required by law? Register for the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points course May 10th in Philly. District Philly meets at the New Yards Brewery the following day, May 11th. District Northwest meets in beautiful Hood River the weekend of May 18th. And District Rocky Mountain holds its technical summit in Fort Collins May 19th. Registration is now open for the ASBC MBAA Brewing Summit, which takes place in San Diego this August. Register at mbaa.com, where you can also view the full calendar of events for more details or find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Some less experienced brewers might view bottle conditioning as a license to not control oxygen pickup in their process, but that really shouldn't be the case, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, most of us know, a lot of us know, oxidation can occur immediately, especially if higher levels of oxygen are introduced. So you're going to get enough oxygen just from a normal filling process for a successful re-fermentation. I think even the little bit of oxygen that you're still going to have in the headspace is enough to get the fermentation off to a good start. But certainly, you don't have to be as concerned about oxygen uptake at packaging as you do with your other projects. But yeah, by no means is this a license to be sloppy and feel like, okay, I need to get all this extra oxygen in, so I'm gonna, when I mix, if I'm doing this with a tank, as most guys will, where they're gonna mix in their priming sugar, wort, whatever, with the beer in a tank, homogenize that good. That doesn't mean, hey, I want to be as violent with this process as possible. You still want to observe good brewing practice, and you'll get plenty of oxygen in. Don't worry about that.
How do you go about troubleshooting when bottle conditioning doesn't go as expected?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because sometimes you again, we've all kind of done this as homebrewers, and we've all had fails where either the beer is highly overcarbonated, and bottle caps are, just think of the Breaking Bad episode, right, with the Schrader brow, or the other scenario where after a month there's nothing. I think the most basic thing that I think people can overlook is to just make sure you're doing a gravity check all along the way, and so make sure what the RDF of the base beer is. So good brewery, simple lab process, we do with every batch is we're always doing the forced attenuations in the lab to make sure we know where the beer is going to finish. Check that against what the real beer is at, because usually it'll finish maybe a tenth of or 2/10 of a point above that. And if for some reason you have a beer that's, say, 0.5 or even 1 Plato above the XTF, then you need to factor that into your math calculation when you're adding your sugar. But anyway, you want to know the product you're putting into the package, what fermentation potential that may still have left. And then, of course, after you add your priming sugar, you want to do a gravity check then to see, what that combined mixture is. And if the degree, the concentration of that priming sugar, so obviously you want to take a gravity check of that in and of itself. But then that combined mixture, you should validate your math. So if your math said, hey, I needed to add, 10 liters of this priming sugar to a 2 hectoliter batch or something, you should, the math would tell you the combined mixture should be at this gravity. So if you're not at that, you need to go back and check, like, hey, did I homogenize this thoroughly? Did I add the right amount of sugar? The nice thing about sugar, of course, is, especially if you start doing this at any kind of scale, is you're going to have empty bags there, right? It's like milling. I always tell guys, save all your bags, your grain bags, till the end of your mill in. Count them up afterwards. That way you can validate, hey, I know I put in this much grain. And then, of course, you can, if you do have a problem on the under fermentation side of the bottle conditioning, you can check your bottles and you can see like, oh my, I'm still a point, this has only moved, 0.2 of a Plato where I would have expected it to move, 1.2 degrees Plato. Why is this stalled out? Now, about the only variable you're going to be able to control at that point is temperature. If for some reason you don't have enough yeast in, or the yeast wasn't healthy, it's pretty unlikely you're going to go through, hundreds or thousands of cases of beer and open them all up and redose. So that one you might have to write off. But so checking temperature in your conditioning area is really important. And, this is the old rule of thumb for any of us who've done any draft system work, right? You can see in a cooler in a bar, they may have a wall-mounted thermometer. Well, if the cooling fan is blowing right on that thermometer, it's going to give a false reading, perhaps, as to what the true temperature in that cooler is. So same thing. You want to know what the temperature of your conditioning space is. And the best way to validate that is super simple. You just take a thermometer, you put it in a glass of water, and that's going to give you the true sort of ongoing temperature of that space. And do that in a few spots, right? Put one at, ground level or just above, and then put one, up high in the rafters of your building, because you're going to be pretty surprised to see what the difference in temperature is. So those are really the simplest, easy ways to make sure if everything else is good, like you're positive, you got the right amount of sugar in, and your temperature's right, then, unfortunately, the last option might be you didn't add enough yeast, or you've got a yeast health issue. So I certainly recommend that when you're just starting to play around with bottle conditioning, make sure you have more yeast than less yeast in there, and dial the yeast. If you want all the benefits of a bottle conditioned beer, but you don't want something that's real hazy, you can kind of dial back the yeast dosing rate a little bit over time.
It sounds like you've been bottle conditioning for a long time. How has your bottle conditioning process changed over the years?
Yeah, I think it's more on just learning, like I say, kind of all the angles to check to make sure that. So it used to be as simple as, all right, mix up the sugar, throw it in, and go. And now it's more on the QA side of it. And again, I think if there's one, key thing to have burned into your brain when bottle conditioning, it's homogenization. So homogenization of mixture, homogenization of temperature during conditioning. And so really over time, I've taken more care to make sure that I'm measuring both of those things, that, I know I've got a good homogeneous, beer, wort, yeast mixture, and that I've got good homogeneous temperature conditions for the re-fermentation. And yeah, the other thing we haven't even talked about, of course, here is micro, and that's a big area where I've improved the game as well. I mean, at Tabernash way back in the days, we definitely had some batches from time to time that the lacto would go crazy, and we couldn't really figure it out. But over time, you start implementing more rigorous biological controls at all stages of the process, and you can really narrow down on your control points where the problem comes up. So that's really the kind of where over time I've learned and minimized the amount of mistakes.
Do you do any keg conditioning?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, obviously with keg conditioning, the challenge there is you sort of have to forget what I was saying about the higher CO2 levels, particularly if you are not going to have some kind of compensator faucet at the tap. And of course, if you're getting your beer out into broader distribution and you're not doing self-distribution, that's not something you can really bank on. But there are special faucets you can purchase that will allow you to dispense higher carbonated beer without having a lot of beer loss at dispense. But otherwise, the process is pretty similar. Again, something to keep in mind. The keg, you've got this huge thermal mass of product that's sitting in there. That's going to take longer to attemperate to your conditioning space area. So again, that's why I always kind of recommend, don't totally cold condition your base beer down to some temperature, like 40 or even 50. Try to keep it on the warmer side, unless, of course, you want to do something sophisticated like run that product through a heat exchanger on the way to packaging to warm it back up. A lot of breweries will do that because there's definitely benefits of cold conditioning the base beer before you go to package it.
That was Eric Warner here on the Master Brewers Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about bottle conditioning, here are 3 great resources you should check out. Type bottle conditioning into the search bar at mbaa.com. The first result is a webinar presented by today's guest. The third result is a link to the article I mentioned earlier in which Bill Pengelly describes Deschutes' original process for bottle conditioning. After you've absorbed all the other great search results from the Master Brewers website, head over to community.mbaa.com and type bottle conditioning into that search bar. Check the box to refine results by the mash, and you'll find a video I filmed of the bottle conditioning panel with the Commons, Deschutes, Cascade, and Freem during the 2016 Master Brewers District Northwest Spring Meeting. There's so much to learn. Start your search now and let Master Brewers help you make better beer.
I should have told you. Maybe 2 things that you should have known. Or maybe 3 things that I should have mentioned. But I did. My fist full of courage. My heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck. I can't be losing too much. And then I'm heading out to any other place. Stuck, I can't be losing too much.